Thanks for joining us today. This is your host, Etisham Hussain. You may have read my short bio when you signed up for the webinar. If you didn't, let me just introduce myself. I have been working in the IT industry for almost 8 years now. I'm a digital marketer by profession, and I am passionate about how IT skills training is delivered and retained and implemented. So, since that's what we do, it's a good thing I work for Quick Start. I could go on and on about myself, but let's move on to the real start of this show, Paul Heuring. Now, I'm sure you read his bio on the landing page for the webinar when you signed up, and I'm sure a lot of you are here because you have read about him and you want to learn from him. Paul has 20 years of experience in information technology. He is a consultant, he is a technical trainer, and he specializes in Microsoft technologies such as Exchange Server, System Center, and Azure, among others. Now, Paul has been with Quick Start for 3 years. He lives in Wisconsin. He also works with the Boy Scouts of America as a volunteer scout leader. So, Paul, why did you choose this topic?
Thanks, Edisham. I chose this topic primarily because it's PowerShell has always been one of my favorite things to teach and to use because well, as it says, it's so powerful. The power in PowerShell is automation and the ability to do a lot of things with a minimal amount of work. Well, it just so happens that as time goes by, cybersecurity fits right in with that capability of PowerShell. And so cybersecurity being as important as ever and using PowerShell to help manage the monstrously large task of being able to work with those things go hand in hand very, very nicely. And so that's why I figured it was probably a good topic for this presentation.
All right. So looks like we can turn our cameras on now, Paul.
Oh, good.
Yeah, they are working. So I want to say welcome to everyone who has joined us, who are people who are just joining us. The webinar is on its way. The topic is using PowerShell for cybersecurity. We are with Paul Heuring. He's one of the best technical trainers in the industry, and we are just about to begin. So over to you, Paul.
Your flattery is nice. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And I think appreciate everybody joining us this afternoon. Before I get lost in the presentation and everything, I should probably point out to you that you can send your questions throughout the session by using the chat that's built in. If you can't find it, just look for the toolbar at the in your Zoom client, and you should be able to do that. It's most easily found by using the Q&A capability that's in there. Obviously we want to answer all the questions that we can, but sometimes we get so many of them that we just have to sort of do our best to go through and do that without interrupting too much. Like I said, I'll try to answer the questions that come in. But if there's too many, remember that you can always just send them to the marketing@quickstart.com email address, which I'm sure Edisham is always will put in place, and or you can visit quickstart.com. We have our Expert Connect, which I'm not going to try and get in too deep in that because I think it's such a cool feature, but it's something that you might want to go check out. And did I mention it's free? Anyway, it's one of those things where we have a community of experts available, and we're more than happy to take questions through that as well. In any case, let's actually get what you came for rolling here. So there's just a couple of things here. As you can see, we're going to be talking about using PowerShell for cybersecurity. And let me just flip through my slides here a little bit. Of course, here's me. I think Edisham covered most everything. He actually been through in my volunteer work, which is kind of nice. I spend a lot of time with kids, and they haven't kicked me out yet, so that's probably a good thing. But in my day job, I am a technical trainer with Quick Start. I guess my official title is senior instructor Nevertheless, I've been a Microsoft certified trainer and consultant since 1999, which means that I started way back with NT4 and Exchange 5.5, and even did some training with Windows 95, Windows 98, and the much maligned Windows ME even. But again, I've grown forward through everything along the way with that, and I'm pleased to have kind of picked up PowerShell early on in its development and release. I don't know if you guys remember this or not, but there was a time where PowerShell wasn't PowerShell yet, but for Active Directory, they released what they called the Directory Service Command Line tools, and they worked with a pipeline, and they worked very similarly to the way that PowerShell eventually, when it was released in 2006, was actually built on. In fact, because I was working with Exchange, I had the opportunity to get hands-on to PowerShell very early, and after some time, I actually discovered how really valuable it is to be able to do, among other things, bulk operations and everything else. Anyway, the whole point of this is to kind of give you the idea that I've been working with PowerShell and then the precursors to PowerShell for quite some time now. Way back in the early days of PCs, I did something that I thought was similar to PowerShell, but it wasn't really all that terribly close. But I started doing some basic, kind of taught myself basic programming way back early in the days. My family bought a Texas Instruments TI-99 home computer, which was really just a glorified an Atari game system with a keyboard. But it was fun, and we kind of, messed around with that thing. So I've been at this for longer than just my professional career. I won't tell you how far back that goes, but it's about the time Cyndi Lauper was introducing herself to the world, if that helps anyway. So the overview of what we're going to be talking about here today, now that I'm done yakking about myself. So the topic, of course, is using PowerShell to help with cybersecurity. But we got to kind of get an understanding and a feel for what cybersecurity is. So I'm really going to start off with an overview, more or less, with what the problem is. And the problem is certainly not a simple one. It's getting to the point where it almost seems like there's just too much. But cybersecurity in a nutshell is where we're going to start off with. And then I'm going to throw up PowerShell as a potential solution for this. Now, again, without getting into too many of the specifics right out of the gate, PowerShell is very important because it allows us to do a couple of things that are absolutely essential for working with security. And that is the ability to remotely manage systems and to automate the process of doing that. What are we doing with those things? Well, there's two big features of PowerShell that help support these things. One of them is called JIA, or Just Enough Administration. The second one is Desired State Configuration. Those are two big things that are important to ensure that our systems are managed appropriately and are configured appropriately and are maintained in that configuration appropriately over time. And so we'll touch on what that actually means. We're going to round everything out by just bragging up how PowerShell has gone from being just Microsoft's command line environment that everybody was kind of keen on it from the Microsoft perspective, and all of a sudden it's available. I've seen it written as open source, but if it's not open source, it most certainly is openly available on both Linux and Unix, and so it's not just for Windows anymore. And so we'll touch on those capabilities a little bit at the end before we wrap everything up. So cybersecurity is the reason why I think a lot of people come to these sorts of webinars, and the reason for it is very simple. Not a day goes by these days anyway, if you watch the news at all, where we don't talk about how cybersecurity is a big issue. Whether you follow politics or whether you just follow business or whether you just kind of read the newspaper on a day-to-day basis, there's talk about how about China and other state actors, Russia and so forth, are hacking, among other things, organizations to gain technology and to gain technological expertise that they don't have to develop themselves, to try and get military secrets, to try and hack our elections. That's even a thing that's come about. And whether or not, you know, the level at which we're talking about these things, you know, matters to you personally, it's all over the place. Cybersecurity is a huge thing, and the reason why is because if we're not secure in our data and in our processes and so forth, then well, you know, we're not going to stay on top of any kind of industry, or even, you know, the United States as a country on top of you know, the economy for very much longer. So cybersecurity is important for a lot of different reasons. It's not just as simple as trying to protect ourselves from other state actors. Sometimes we got to protect ourselves from ourselves. And so most of us work in a world where we are subject to some sort of legislative jurisdiction that says we have to be careful with information. We talk about PII, that's personally identifiable information. We talk about HIPAA. HIPAA has been around for a good long time. There's SOX, there's all kinds of other, depending on other countries that you work with. Most recently, the European Union has started up with a set of rules that deal with the security of confidential and personally identifiable information as well. We are inundated with requirements, and we need to be able to simplify our means by which we can actually support all of those things. It's an absolute must, not just because we want to protect our own proprietary information, but we also need to keep track of something as simple as customer data, the payment card information that is used to purchase things if you have a website. Well, anyway, to kind of try and nutshell the whole thing, I was trying to come up with something, and I was looking around at other sources, and I came across from the Cisco website. You can see the link that's on the slide here, and they had this sort of succinct quote that sort of embodies the whole thing, and I just use that as the example. Cybersecurity is the practice of protecting systems, networks, and programs from digital attacks. That's a pretty succinct statement. The attacks that we work with as it continues are usually aimed at accessing, changing, or destroying sensitive information, or extorting money from users, or just interrupting normal business processes. So the point of cybersecurity is to put in place practices to protect all of that. That's really what we're all about. Now, to get to that point, cybersecurity uses an awful lot of ways to describe. I mean, you know, the people that work in this realm use an awful lot of words to describe what's going on here. What I always like to think about is that when we're talking about cybersecurity, there's risks that sort of need to be managed from a multitude of different directions. So what we need to think about when we're thinking about security in general, and in particular protecting our own systems, is sort of a series of concentric circles within which we need to be more and more secure. I come to this from an old perspective. Many years ago, it seems like lifetimes ago, I was a member of the U.S. Army. I enlisted out of high school in 1984. So there, now all of a sudden I've given my age. But anyway, there was you go through basic training, and everybody's seen movies and shows about all that. Haven't probably any number of you have gone through basic training or boot camp of some sort. But I just want to talk about one thing that we did in basic training somewhere in the middle of rural Missouri in an evening, probably around this time of year. And it was sort of just like a night defense kind of class that we were taking that night. And it was just about twilight, and everything was about to get dark. And basically what they did is they had us all line up in bleachers, and they basically went through this long thing, and they taught us about this thing called defense in depth. Now, to me, the only time I ever heard the word defense was in sports, right? So I'm thinking, okay, well, the baseball, you know, the defense is on the field, and they got to catch the ball, right? Or in football, you got to stop them from getting a first down, or whatever, right? Defense is all of that stuff. Defense in depth basically says is built on a couple of different tenets. Whether we're talking about a bunch of dopey high school graduates trying to learn about protecting themselves in the case of a war, or whether we're trying to talk about protecting our networks, what defense in depth means is we got to have defenses that allow several different obstacles in the way of getting in. So you want to have protection across computers, networks, data, and programs to be able to make this happen. What that means is that we have to put defenses in place everywhere where a potential attacker might try and breach the systems that we're protecting. So we have, certain things like firewalls, right? Just as an example. Um, so defense in depth is a very important process, and what defense in depth and that mentality entails is stopping an attacker as far away from the sensitive information as possible. For we dopey kids that were learning about defense in depth at basic training way back when, it was about stopping an enemy that might get close enough to be able to kill us. Thankfully, I personally never had to get too close to that kind of action. But the point is that we're talking about the data and protecting our networks in this case, right? And so if we can stop somebody at the perimeter, we're golden. If they get through that, then let's give them some other hurdles that they need to get over. So let's protect our network by putting network intrusion detection systems. Let's protect the data with permissions and with encryption. Let's make sure that the programs are configured in a way that are as secure as possible. You get the idea, right? Defense in depth says, let's, even if they do get inside of our firewall, let's protect again further back and further back until we're basically protected, and we've done everything that we can to protect ourselves and protect the data and the confidentiality and the personally identified and so forth. The second really big part of cybersecurity is people. This is true. So the big thing here is making sure that the people that are part of our network understand the risks that are available and understand the procedures that are in place to make this happen. I like to share this story about my daughter because she's kind of a funny kid to begin with. She's 14 years old. She just started a couple of days ago her freshman year in high school. And as she's getting ready to go to the high school, we get, the emails with the policies and this, that, and the other thing in there. And she was complaining to me. She says, "Dad," I said, "Yeah." She says, "Dad, why is it that if I want to bring my laptop to school, that I have to let them manage it? What are they going to do? Are they going to try and look at my web links and all of that stuff?" And I tried to explain to her that if you're going to use their networks, if you're going to access their systems, they want to just ensure that you're as secure as you can be and that you're not using, your laptop for stupid stuff, is basically what I explained to her. And after a little bit of talk about that, she kind of understood, even though she still didn't like it, she understood, right? That's a carrot and stick mentality, right? So if she wanted to use her laptop at school, she was going to have to submit to their rules and a little bit of, of software that was going to ensure that, things were as secure as they could be. So knowledgeable users is an important part of that. And part of that, in her case, was understanding that those rules are in place. But there's more to it than that in an enterprise, right? Or in an enterprise-like situation. Users have to know about passwords, and they have to actually use secure passwords. We've become very good at making sure that users have secure passwords, that they change them frequently, and that all those things are in there. We've also become better about letting them know about potential risks, like clicking on an email attachment, for example. And we put other measures in place, like, again, firewalls and antivirus and so forth, that can help to sort of protect us from those things. But it's not just enough to have a secure environment. We have to have users who understand the security of the situation as well. After those things are in place, then we also have to take a look at the processes. So the processes that are part of our cybersecurity stature, such as it is, have to be set up in such a way that they're secure as well, and that we understand that there's a way to identify attacks when they're happening, to be able to respond to the threats, and if they are successful, to be able to recover from them. To have essentially a set of instructions, or at least a set of procedures, or at least a framework to be able to understand how to recognize it, how to respond, and how to recover. So those processes have to be defined before we ever have a problem. We need to think through what could happen, and if it does, what do we do? And finally, the technology that is in place is going to help us to manage all of these things as well. So we have to have technology to protect endpoints. This includes computers, devices that people are using. BYOD is a fantastic example of that, of how we need to make sure that those devices are secure as well. Routers and other network devices have to be set up in such a way. We've got networks in general that have to be secure. We have to have cloud-based resources in a lot of cases that also need to be secured appropriately. So the technology has to be in place to protect all of those things. This is going to include things like firewalls, anti-malware, if necessary, DNS filters that allow us to manage the inbound and outbound traffic, and also email security systems like anti-spam and antivirus that are checked at the gate at an SMTP gateway, for example. So that stuff that is bad doesn't even make it into our email systems. It gets caught at some other device or service that we're using for those things. This is also, from the technology perspective, where PowerShell can help us as well. PowerShell is an important tool for not everything that we're looking at. We can't really manage a router by using PowerShell. Well, I mean, I suppose we could if we had the right modules and everything in place, but PowerShell can help in a lot of different ways. So how? Why PowerShell? Well, let's go take a look at that. So PowerShell offers a couple of very important tools and features that, that you're probably aware of, but help us with cybersecurity. Most importantly, there's remote manageability and automation. Remote manageability means that PowerShell is built specifically to allow us the ability to reach out to systems. So from a centralized workstation, so me sitting here at my desktop, I can remotely connect up to other systems and I can manage them by using remoting. It relies very heavily on Windows Remote Management in the context that we're looking at in here. Windows Remote Management is a service and a set of protocols that basically allow for that remote connectivity. It has to be enabled in order to make that happen. We'll come back and take a look at that in just a few moments. But that ability to use Windows Remote Management interactively and also in an automated way that makes PowerShell very valuable for all of these things. Why? Because I don't have to be sitting in front of the console of a particular system to be able to manage that system. And you and I, we all know that this becomes more and more untenable to have to visit each system as the numbers of servers that we work with start to increase. PowerShell is also extensible. It is extensible simply by adding needed modules. Now, modules are kind of an interesting thing. If you're not initiated into the PowerShell world, let me explain what a module is very quickly. And once again, I'll use kind of a story to try and help illustrate what that all means. So many years ago, again, sometime in between being a dopey kid, learning about defense in depth for the first time, and today, I was in college. I went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I'm a Badger. That's just the way it is. And we're excited because the football season has started and all kinds of fun stuff goes on. I'm 120 miles away, which makes me sad, but it's an okay thing. Anyway, when I was in college, I met this beautiful woman who is now my wife. And at the time, we had been dating for a couple years actually by that point. And so we were pretty firm in our relationship, but she needed to get her car worked on. Her brakes were squealing and squeaking, and she had decided that it's time to do something about it because, well, squealing and squeaking brakes are no good. And she went to one of the muffler and brake shops that you probably have heard of, and she got an estimate for the job, and it was somewhere between $300 and $400. Being poor college students, we didn't have that kind of money to just go throwing around at stuff. And she came over to my place, and she was complaining about that. And I thought, I am going to be the knight in shining armor here. I am going to go out there and I am going to replace the brake pads on her brakes because I know how to do that. And I also knew that her dad was a big car guy and a big do-it-yourself, and he like built hot rods and stuff like that. So I was not only going to be the knight in shining armor to this beautiful woman that I thought one day might actually become my wife, but I was also going to ingratiate myself to my future father-in-law. What a brilliant move this was. So I thought to myself, it was a nice, like today, it was around, September maybe, and beautiful outside, not too hot, not too cold, that kind of thing. So I went out and I jacked up her car, and I took off a wheel, and then started to work on the brakes that were in there, and I realized that her car was made by a different manufacturer than my car. Why is this important? Well, it helps to illustrate something that's really important. I had worked on my brakes on my car, and I knew exactly which tools I needed, and I grabbed all those tools and I brought them out there confident and everything else. And then, sort of to drive home the point that I was, the type of guy that could handle these sorts of things, I asked her, hey, in about 20 minutes, just bring out, like some water or something so I can get a drink. And she's like, okay. And so she did. And as a just at the point where I thought I was going to look like one of the smartest guys in the world, I was like, I can't do this. And she's like, why? I said, because I don't have the right tools. And PowerShell works much the same way. You got to have the right tools. As it turns out, in this case, I needed to have a specific type of a socket to be able to remove the brake caliper from her system. Why? Because that's the way that manufacturer did that. And I didn't have those tools. So I had to run and hop in my car, and I had to run over to actually Sears at the time. And it was pretty close to where we lived. So I ran over to Sears and I bought what I needed, and I came back, and then I was able to complete the job, being the hero that I was. But I didn't have the right tools. Just like with PowerShell, you got to have the right tools. Well, the tools that I bought were in a packet, right, of a set of like specific sockets, right? They were Torx bits is what they ended up being. And I needed that set of tools. And the tools in PowerShell are packaged in modules. So a module is basically like a set of tools that you add to your toolkit so that you can then further enhance what you're able to do. Well, some of the tools that we're going to be talking about using in here are not in PowerShell by default. You have to go get those tools, and the place to get them is from, well, the PowerShell gallery or GitHub. See, I went to Sears because it was regular tools to work on a car, but your tool store is going to be either the PowerShell gallery or GitHub. And there's other places where these modules might be available as well. But those are two places that Microsoft kind of has a big hand in. And so, well, they recently bought GitHub. I don't know, it was probably 6 months ago or something by now. But so, that's where the tested and the sort of the approved, quote unquote, approved tools are going to be available to you. And indeed, that's where you got to go to get some of these tools. So the remote manageability and automation are really great, but if you don't have the right tools, you're not fixing your girlfriend's brakes. That's just the way it is. And in this case, you're not managing those remote servers. You're going to need the tools to be able to go through and do that. But why PowerShell? Because it has those tools available to you. All you have to do is go and get them. By the way, the tools are real easy to work with. I have a web browser that's open here. Let's see. Here's just an example. This is the PowerShell desired state configuration resources. Again, this is a central repository for that kind of stuff. And this is at GitHub, and you can basically just download these things. So you have, the DSC resource templates and so forth that are all in here. And again, let's just hold off on what some of that stuff means, but this is, it's available to you, right? So I'm not even signed in yet to GitHub, and I can download this stuff and make it available. These tools cost less than the tools that I had to go run over to Sears to fix my then girlfriend's brakes. Anyway, you have to have those things available to you. So why PowerShell? Because PowerShell has the flexibility to be able to allow us to remotely administer very important security settings on these systems. What kind of things are we talking about? Well, indeed, there's a couple of different things that we need to manage when we're talking about security. You guys, I'm sure, have gone through lectures upon lectures and read white papers and everything else about what needs to be done to harden systems. And I'm not going to try and go through and talk about all of that. But basically, some of the main things that we talk about when we talk about hardening, especially Windows servers, but not just Windows servers, are two basic things, right? One of those is the principle of least rights, or least privilege, right? The principle of least privilege across managed systems is an important thing. Why? Because when people log on to those systems, to be able to administer whatever it is they're administering on those systems, they need permissions. They need permissions to do whatever it is that they need to do. But if we're doing it right, we make sure that they get just enough permissions to do what they need to do, no more and no less. And that's the premise upon which just enough administration is built. just enough administration means that we're going to utilize that. So the problem, that's one of the problems that we have to work through to be able to secure systems and make sure that they're as secure as they need to be. In other words, to protect those systems from outside influences, but also to protect ourselves from ourselves. We want to make sure that people that administer systems or parts of systems only have the permissions that they need to do their jobs. It's a huge thing that we talk about. It's fundamental with security, right? The principle of least privilege, but it's hard to implement, or was hard to implement. So that's kind of an important thing. So that's kind of important. The other part, another really big important part is making sure that those systems are configured appropriately, to the extent that, remember, things like ports, you want to minimize the open ports. You want to make sure that only the services that are necessary on a system are running. And so to be able to manage those things requires certain aspects. So when we harden systems, I mean, what we try to do is, I mean, the general term is we want to reduce the attack surface, and we want to always adhere to the principle of least privilege. Those are two very important parts of that. That makes sense to everybody in here, right? I'm sure it does. I'm sure it does. So as we make our way into this notion of just enough administration, we kind of see where we're headed with this. Well, just enough administration is more than just using privileged groups and making sure that, we don't make everybody a member of domain admins. It takes it a step further. What it does is it uses non-privileged groups for delegation. So that's kind of a complicated statement on its own, but delegation means that we're delegating certain permissions to people to be able to do things on systems. But using a non-privileged group for delegation is a better way to do it than making somebody a member of administrators or something like that. Why? Because now we have the ability to say exactly what it is that they can do. In order to take advantage of just enough administration, there's a couple of prerequisites that are in place. It requires, first of all, WMF 5.1. That's the Windows Management Framework, which is a number of different things that are incorporated with that. But that's included with Windows Server 2016. So if you're not on Windows Server 2016, then you may have to install WMF 5.1 on some older systems. So that's kind of it's an important thing to understand. And then to use it, you have to set up a couple of different things to make it happen. There's a process by which this gets implemented. So you need a roles capability file. So a roles capability file defines that which somebody can do. You need a session configuration. So the configuration for people to connect PowerShell up to a system. And then you have to register that configuration as an endpoint in Windows Remote Management in WinRM. So there's 3 steps to all of that. I got kind of a demonstration to take you through to kind of show you how that works. But basically, what this Windows Management Framework does is it sets us up with the ability to manage all of those things. Here's kind of how it comes together. So again, the first thing we're going to do is put together what's called a roles capability file, or role capability files defines what we're going to allow somebody to do and which groups are going to be allowed that access. And then we'll put that together in what's called a session configuration and then register it. All right, so again, it's like I said, this is sort of a demonstration. It's not completely there. So here's our just enough administration. So the first step in the process, of course, is using this new role capability file. And in order to do that, and all I did here was I set this up so that you could see what this might look like. So this is all done in PowerShell. I'm using the PowerShell ISE, the integrated scripting environment, to help illustrate these things. And so all I've got here is this new role capability file. And in order to run this thing, there's a number of different parameters and everything else. Most of them are related to what you see here. But basically, we have so the path to where that file is going to go. Now, again, there's restrictions as to where exactly it can be, and it has to be in the PS module path and everything else. So there's a couple of different things that need to be done to ensure that it's in the right place, but in order to fully utilize it. But this is how you can set this thing up. So when I ran it earlier, all I did was I just ran it so that I have alias definitions, assemblies to load, and so forth. But what we're doing here is we're saying that once a configuration is built using this roles capability file, these are the things that are going to be available. So what we're doing is we're giving administrators that are going to be using this session configuration that's going to be built on this, these tools and these tools only. So we're going to hand them a set of wrenches, and we're going to hand them a screwdriver, but we're not handing them all screwdrivers and all wrenches, only the ones that they need to manage the stuff that they have. That makes sense, doesn't it? So we can say we only want these alias definitions available, only these assemblies, only these formats to process, and the modules to import into that session can be limited to the modules that we explicitly specify. The scripts to process, the types of objects to process, variable definitions, and visible aliases, so that which will be available, commandlets, external commands, we can even limit that from that PowerShell session, the functions, providers, and so forth, right? And so that's the basics for how all that comes together. I notice there's a couple of questions that are coming in here. Oh, I'm sorry. John said that can you hear me okay? Everybody can hear me all right?
Yep.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure. I didn't realize it's very unlike me to not be heard. So, but I'm usually being told to quiet down, to be honest. Just ask my kids. Anyway, so all right. Well, in any case, so this lets us define what exactly is available. So what is this the PS role capability file going to look like? Well, when you have this PS role capability file put together, this is what we have: sample.psrc. Now, again, this is just an example that we put in place. It's not a script file, so it doesn't come up exactly the same. But you notice that we have all of these things in here, right? So we have modules to import when applied to a session. So modules to import equal things like my custom module or and so forth, right? So you would have a list of modules that you would work with. So whether it's like the web server module or that sort of thing, right? So those sorts of things, aliases and the commandlets and so forth. And it would have a list of all of these things if I went through the trouble of actually putting that list together to put this thing in here. I didn't want to make it too terribly long, but this is exactly the type of thing that you would want to put together. Does it take time? Yep, it most certainly does. And I'm not going to lie to you and say that this is not complex, but it's not hard. It is complex because there's a lot of things that you need to cover with, but the concept is relatively straightforward. And so this PSRC file, this the role capabilities file, is there specifically to make sure that we can document what we want an administrator to be able to do when we set up a session based on these sets of things. Well, the next part of that then is to make it so that that file is used then to set up a configuration. So new PS session configuration file then says that we're going to take all of these things, the assemblies, the aliases, and the commandlets, and even the external commands that will be available to the users who will connect using that session, and to put them in this PSSC file, which again is basically going to then be used to define what that configuration is. So anyway, here's an example of that. And once again, it looks mostly like it's all comments, but these are the things that it ends up putting together. Once this PSSC file is available, so under just enough administration, so we have the roles capability file that we use then to build the session configuration. We have to register that on these remote systems. That's not hard to do either, but it has to be registered, and so we have to oftentimes remotely register those things. But what that does then, and by the way, you can use what we're going to talk about in just a minute, desired state configuration, to make that registration happen. Then when somebody enters a session based on their remote connection to that system, whether it's an explicit session or an implicit connectivity session, we have that connection registered as a specific endpoint inside of PowerShell. So normally you just connect up to a PowerShell instance and that's that. But we can force people to connect to these instances instead, which then has a limited tool set that's available to them based on their group memberships. So then they can only administer what we've given them permissions to administer, no matter what. Furthermore, we don't have to have them signing in and using membership in one of those highly privileged groups to be able to make that happen. We can use non-privileged group accounts or non-privileged user accounts for that matter to make sure that they can only get the tools that they need to do their job, no more and no less. And that's exactly what we need to do to help, lower that attack surface, to make it as slight as possible. So that's the idea of just enough administration. We want to just make sure that they have the tools they need to do their job, so that they can change the brakes on their girlfriend's car, or manage the web server instance that they're supposed to be managing, or instances across multiple systems. Just enough administration allows us to take these configurations and register them across multiple systems, and to make it as part of a larger set of configurations that we want to put in place to keep things secure, and as secure as possible. So I guess what I should do is I should probably pause at this point and ask if anybody has any questions, or if there's any questions that Adisham, does anybody have any questions that they've shared?
No, not yet.
I must just be explaining everything so crystal clear.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's move forward then. Just remember, if you do have questions, fire them at us. We'll deal with them as best as we can. Well, that's just enough administration, and this is totally a feature of PowerShell. And again, in conjunction with the Windows Management Framework, we can set these things up and therefore give people the specific tools they need to do their jobs. That's giving the users that are going to administer these systems the tools that they need using PowerShell to make that happen. The other side of that same coin that we talked about earlier. So we know that we need to make sure that we've got this principle of least privilege in place. The other side of that is hardening these systems to make sure that they are exposed only to the point that they should be exposed. And this is where desired state configuration comes in. So desired state configuration is designed to take a file describing how a node or how a computer specifically should be configured, and then also to ensure that it's always configured to that specification. In other words, we're not going to run a script and say, here, configure that computer that way, because that's cumbersome, right? We don't want to run a configuration and then in 15 minutes rerun the configuration and rerun the configuration. So we should only have to set up a server one time. But configuration has a tendency to drift. And by that I mean that, whether it's just something that naturally happens because applications or use or whatever have a tendency to sort of do their own thing, or if something more malign is happening, where somebody is trying to attack that system and they're trying to change the configuration that way. What desired state configuration can do is it can notice these things and then respond appropriately. The main thing that we like it to do is to just reconfigure to bring it back into alignment with what we want that configuration state to look like. So if we have services that we want to have running, or maybe more importantly, services that shouldn't be running, we want to make sure that they're in that state. This is something that's used in a couple of different contexts and in a couple of different ways. With Microsoft, you have network quarantine that's available to us, and one of the ways that is used is network quarantine can check the state of a system, and then through a health report and a health registration authority and everything else, we can determine whether or not they're okay to enter the network. This is something similar to that, but not exactly the same. What desired state configuration does is it specifically looks to make sure that a server, for example, a web server, or a bank of web servers, perhaps maybe 5, 10, 100 web servers that are all supposed to be configured the same, are configured appropriately, and that we can check on a regular basis. This is part of the Windows Management Framework 4.0 and newer. So WMF 4.0 and newer manage these things. What it uses is these MOF files, MOF files. The MOF files, that stands for Managed Object Format, or sometimes you see Managed Object File Format as the explanation of it. But basically, these MOF files basically are built in such a way that they put together a declarative statement of how that system is supposed to be set up. And by working in conjunction with these MOF files that basically say this is how it should be configured, something known as the Local Configuration Manager, or the LCM, and then DSC Resources, Desired State Configuration Resources, to basically allow us the ability to use those MOF files to then ensure that everything is configured appropriately. So
we have a question, Paul, we have a question from Chris. He's asking, where can we download PowerShell for Linux and Unix?
Oh, that's a good question. In a couple more minutes, I'll show you exactly where that is. But just to put it in a nutshell, if I was looking for PowerShell for Linux, Unix, I'd go to Microsoft and just search for PowerShell for Linux, and they'll actually take you there. It's pretty straightforward. They've got from the download center at Microsoft, it's available. But if you just go to even just to TechNet, it's available there. So, good question. But back to the desired state configuration. So these files have to be set up. Obviously, these MOF files have to be set up. The local configuration manager is the service that runs on these remote systems, and then they have access to the DSC resources to make sure that they're available. Well, the management of these things can be set up in two different ways. There's push and pull. The push model is enabled by default, and basically what it does is it ensures that the systems have the configuration files that they need by us pushing them out to them. The push model is enabled by default on all systems that support desired state configuration, and it's set to check every 15 minutes. On the desired state configuration to ensure that it's checked every 15 minutes. That's the default. You can change that so it checks more often. The pull model is a little bit more complicated, but it then offers better centralized management, because in the pull model, the clients, basically the servers that we want to administer, will check every so often to see if there's any new versions of these MOF files that are available, and it'll pull them to them. To ensure that that's in there. But it entails setting up either like an SMB share or even a web server that's running a web service to work with that. And you have to configure the addresses and everything else. But if need be, in a more dynamic type of environment, the pull model, although more complicated, does give you a stronger measure of centralization. So those things are available. But this desired state configuration hinges on these MOF files being available and then just letting the system check itself. So if you had an organization, so I just make up an example just to kind of help illustrate why this is so important. Let's say that there's a company out there called Paul's Podunk RetailersRUs.com. Paul's Podunk has a web service, and it's very busy. This web service includes a shopping app and the shopping cart and all of those sorts of things. And they have hundreds, thousands, dare I say millions of customers a day that are coming into this. And so in order to support those things, they have a dynamic structure set up that basically spins up dozens upon dozens upon dozens of web servers at any one point in time to be able to support all of those users in a way that makes sense. Every single one of those web servers is hosting, one or more sessions that are involved with that. And so that's an awful lot of risk that's out there. I cannot reliably predict, as the CIO of Paul's Podunk, whether or not I'll have 1,000 or 500 servers at any given point in time. It's set up to respond to the workload as appropriate, which, what a great way to configure these things. But every single one of those servers that starts up needs to be configured in a way that's secure, so that my customer's data is kept secure, and so that my company is not breached in any way either. So I'm going to use desired state configuration in either a push or pull model. It doesn't really matter all that much, but what I'm going to do is ensure that when those systems come online, they have everything they need in terms of a MOF file and the DSC resources to implement those things to make sure that if they drift for whatever reason, they can be reconfigured appropriately automatically without me having to intervene whatsoever. That's what we're trying to do here. So how do we set all of these things up? Well, again, there's a couple of steps that are involved, right? We have to set up what our desired state is going to be. We have to tell the system, here's what we want you to look like. And we have to make sure that they have the resources in place and that their local configuration manager process is configured appropriately as well. I'm gonna just bounce over here once again to my sort of example here. And we're just gonna do this thing. So first of all, the desired state configuration is built in to Windows, or to PowerShell basically, in the Windows Management Framework 4.0 and newer. So if you've got Windows 10 workstations, they're up to date. If you got Windows Server 2016, Windows 2012 R2, or what have you, they'll all have everything that you need to implement all of these things. Let me just switch my view here so that I've got a little bit of a I'm going to show the results of some of these things. So the first thing I'm going to do, so the PowerShell behind this, basically, we're going to check on this system. So this is going to be my management workstation. And I'm going to run get DSC resource. And this is just to basically see what DSC resources are available on this system. We can do this against another computer if we want to. And so there's ways to go about that. I'm just going to select this and run it quick. And we're going to see that after it finishes here, there we go, that I have on here these resources. So each one of these things, so like we have a file resource, signature validation, package management source, archive, a bunch of other things, logs, registry, script, service is kind of an interesting one. But so maybe we'll kind of work with the service resource just to kind of take a look at what's going on. And so we're gonna just peek at that thing. So let me bring this back in here. And what I'm gonna do next, so here, let me clean my screen up here a little bit. I'm gonna run get DSC resource service. And so, and then we're gonna select, just pipe that to the select expand properties to see how that service resource is configured. I wanna see what properties basically are available to me. Let me run that. And so again, it's gonna go through and load the appropriate things. And once again, we can see that, okay, so the service DSC resource, right, has these properties. So there's the name, the credential, dependencies, depends on, ensure, path. There's a path there, the DSC run as credential, the startup type, and everything else. So services all have these things like a startup type and a state. We know that services, if we were to look for services, right? So if I just said, get service, right? Get service and run that, I get services, right? So their status, the name of the service, and then of course a better description. So basically the user-friendly name, right, of the services, the display name that's in there. So and these things are all available in here. Well, we can use these resources basically to define then, for example, the startup type. So if we wanted a particular service to be set to start automatically, we can make that happen. So anyway, to set these things, you can actually go to the service resource and you can then set some of those parameters. So for example, to set the startup type to automatic, to make sure that it's running so that the state is running. That way, the local configuration manager on the destination system can look and see, oh, well, if the bits service isn't running, and if it's not set to start automatically, I'm going to make that happen. So it'll automatically remediate those things every 15 minutes by default. How do we know it's 15 minutes, you might be thinking? Good question. Here's how. So the local configuration manager is the thing that makes that happen, or the LCM. So the first thing you need to realize is that in order to invoke Windows PowerShell remoting, Windows Server has remoting enabled by default. So that's not an issue. On other systems, it might be an issue. An easy way to manage that is to just run set WSMan quick config with a force switch on the end of it. That way you don't have to click yes a bunch of times. Anyway, you can run that, and that will actually then turn that on. Again, because and it happens pretty quickly when you use force, because it doesn't wait for you to have to decide whether or not that's an okay thing. So anyway, that configures that. Anyway, it was set up for remote management on the computer ahead of time, but I wanted to show you what that was. So WSMan, the Windows Services for Management, quick config force, and that enables the appropriate services for remoting. Then we can run so here, let me just put a couple of lines in here to clean this up a little bit. So we're going to use this get DSC local configuration manager. So the LCM configuration, such as it is right now, is going to be in here. And so I'm going to run this, and this is how things are configured right now on this system. So there's two things I said to note. Note the refresh mode and the configuration mode frequency minutes. So the refresh mode is down here. They're in alphabetical order, in case you're wondering. Refresh mode is set here, and it's set to push. Remember, we said it's push mode by default. If you put it into pull mode, there's a little bit more that needs to be configured for that. But you can use the set DS local configuration manager to set those things up. Also, there's the refresh mode, or the configuration mode frequency. So the configuration mode frequency is going to check every 15 minutes by default. So that's how, those are a couple of the things that are configurable. And these are just the setup for these things. Well, so now we know how the local configuration manager is configured. If we want to change that configuration, we have to actually set up a file. Remember, we talked about how you can set up the files for that. So an MOF file needs to be configured to make that happen. And then we can actually set the DS local configuration manager and then give it the path to the file. It will not run without the configuration file, so I can't really run this one, but because I don't have an MOF file available. But it is that's how you would run it. And if you want to run it against a remote system, the computer name parameter will accept multiple computer names as well. So again, if you want to do that. But that's desired state configuration and how to configure the local configuration manager. So again, in summary, in order to make sure that that DSC is going to do what it's supposed to do for us, we remember it takes a configuration file, which is an MOF format file, so MOF file. The local configuration manager itself is designed basically to receive that file and then to check every so often, 15 minutes by default, to make sure that whatever those configurations are supposed to look like. So if it's services, we need to have the DSC service resource available. That's pretty easy because that's there by default. But others you might need to download. Where do you get those? Funny you should ask. Once again, GitHub is the place to go, and I'm just going to bounce back over here and I'll answer the question from earlier. Chris had asked earlier about where to get PowerShell for Linux. So this is that DSC resources. And again, if you're looking for a specific resource, you can find, you can search this interface as well. This is GitHub. If you're not familiar with it, it's a handy place to find scripts, and in this case, resources and so forth. So anyway, there's a lot of different things that are available. Like for example, all the submodules are part of what's in here. So if we click on that, you can see there's Azure and Chrome and all kinds of DHCP server and so forth. There's a bunch of different things that are all in here. That's this is at GitHub. GitHub is a great place to go to find all of those things. So that's this is where you can go and find some of those resources if they're not available. Remember my story from earlier, you have to have the right tools. Indeed, this is where you go to get the tools. This is the tool store, so to speak. So anyway, that's desired state configuration. Once again, it does require some time and effort to sit down and think through what exactly needs to be in place. Don't forget to collaborate with your application owners and the subject matter experts for all of those things, because if their application requires some arcane service to be running and we don't account for that, we're not fully setting the desired state for those things. So there's a sort of a holistic view to this thing, and you're going to have lunch with somebody probably to make that happen. But desired state configuration is a very important tool. And again, when you use that in conjunction with the just enough administration, you have a couple of really solid tools to be able to work with your systems to be able to make sure they're configured. Does anybody have any other questions at this point? All righty. Well, let's do this then. Let's talk about how PowerShell isn't just for Windows anymore. So you can use desired state configuration with a number of different Linux distributions. There's resources that are available, and they handle these things. So again, it includes some of these like CentOS and Debian and Oracle and SUSE Linux Enterprise Server and so forth. This is probably not a comprehensive list, by the way. This is so you know, if you have a particular version or a particular flavor of Linux that you'd like to work with, check with the vendor or check with the developer to see whether or not it's in there. But that's not where it stops. PowerShell also is compatible with Mac OS 10.12 or Mac OS Sierra, I guess is what it is. Now, I'm no Macintosh expert, and I will never claim to be one. Although my first personally owned PC was the original Macintosh, and it sure was powerful for its time. But anyway, that's a whole nother story. PowerShell, both of these things, so Linux in particular, but they require the OMI, so Open Management, what is it, Institute, something like that. Anyway, OMI SIM server, so SIM is the Common Information Model, version 1.0.8.1, and then, of course, the desired state configuration for Linux needs to be in place for that as well, which, again, you can download from GitHub and other places besides. But that's important. This SIM is the same SIM that is used with the WMI repository inside of Windows-based systems. In case you're not familiar with it, that's all put together by this organization that was thought up many years ago, called the Distributed Management Task Force, or the DMTF, that basically defined what was the root for management tools the way that we use them today. So WMI, the SIM as a set of protocols, and also as a repository, those things are there and are fully accessible by using PowerShell, not just for desired state configuration, but even just in being able to set and configure things by using PowerShell for that. Oh, it's a whole nother pile of things to talk about. Maybe we'll do another webinar on that sometime soon. But anyway, it does require that SIM server version to be able to make that happen, because otherwise you can't make the right connections to that. It's all built into Windows by default. And then PowerShell Core supports Mac OS 10.12 and higher, as I said. And of course, if you want to go get PowerShell for those distributions, there's like I said, the best thing to do is this is installing PowerShell Core on Mac OS. This is just some instructions that are available right at Microsoft. So this is just Microsoft's, it's TechNet is where I started looking for that. So docs.microsoft.com. Like I said, go to Microsoft and just search for PowerShell for Linux or Unix. Here it is on Linux. So PowerShell Core on Linux. Again, it's available here. And again, Ubuntu, CentOS, OpenSUSE, and so forth. All of these are in here. So these are all there for you. So free for the asking from our friends at Microsoft. So one of the reasons why PowerShell can be very valuable for these things is because you can do desired state configuration across platforms as well. So just enough administration, the availability of desired state configuration are just some of the tools, are just another couple of tools that are available to you from PowerShell to help manage this hugely complex task of managing cybersecurity. And hopefully what we've talked about over the last hour or so is going to be valuable to you as you start to look at options for managing these things. So in any case, I want to just kind of round out the whole thing by asking if anybody has any further questions about all of these things.
All right, so if any questions arise later on, feel free to drop me an email, or you can always find Paul on Expert Connect. And we really encourage questions and answers over there as well. Paul, thank you for this wonderful session. It was really informative. Even though I'm not that technical of a guy, but I understood some of it. So it was really good. Thank you. And thanks everyone. Thank you everyone for being here. Hopefully I'll see you guys in our next webinar. Thank you. Thank you everyone. Bye.
Thanks everybody.